This is for the nerds, this is for the brainiacs, this what we deserve. Go ahead and play it, man, I know it, I know.
A good representation of what the mastermind is was exemplified, I think, by a Finding Equilibrium video recently, where he talks about like Gto bucketing. And this is a concept that, you know, is pretty near and dear to me in the sense that I think it's the only way to practically apply poker strategy in the live realm. And I was talking to Landon about this, of how much things come in waves in this community, where it was like, you know, if we're talking about like 7-8 years ago when the solver wave finally hit and game theory was clearly going to be a default line of logic that we utilize in this game. At that point, it was just like, okay, we've built these engines and they have answers for us. Everybody brace yourself. Right. And now it was all the data analysts came out of the woodwork and like, I'm going to be fucking good at poker. And they just, you know, they started running scripts and they're running all these sims and they're just looking at it and they're like, yo, I know what I'm doing here. Okay, so like I can simplify and I can bet third pot on all boards and everybody's fucked because the field is just going to still overfold. And, you know, I have this roadmap to printing money. And they were right. They were absolutely right because there was a lot of hubris in poker. There still is. And people are very slow to adapt. So these new strategic trends caught on, right? Like down betting became a thing. Everybody was in there, you know, third potting. Not everybody, but like the good players were now evolving into third pot strategies. And they were just mimicking what they saw. They didn't care why it worked. All they knew was that it fucking worked. And they knew exactly what to do after they third potted on most board textures, right? Or maybe not that they knew exactly what to do, but they had a plan of what to do.
They had an idea.
Yeah, whether it was correct or not doesn't really matter. They had a follow-up. They weren't lost, right? And that just put them miles ahead of everybody else who was lost in the weeds trying to brain solve in real time and just saying like, you know, I feel comfortable with this hand or I don't feel comfortable with this hand. And so it's like, I'm going to, whatever. So they really exploited the fact that people were fallible and they stuck rigidly, and I mean rigidly, to the plan of attack of this is what the solver says, this is what I'm going to do, yada, 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 right? Well, eventually the field started to catch up. So fast forward to like 2016, 2017, and now all of a sudden mixing is all the rave, right? So we're no longer just pure betting third pot on flops. We have to like look at the different textures and we recognize that there are mixed strategies and, you know, we have to work in balanced checkbacks. And now all of a sudden, and you can attest to this, when we started preparing for dead money, when we bucketed people as studied or GTO type of players, we immediately just blanketed said that they'll check back flop too much, right?
Yeah, it was either like the strategy was super simple. It was either they check back the flop or they're tripling all 100%, high frequency.
100%, right? Like if they start bet, expect a trip, period.
Yeah.
Because they're only starting bet on advantageous boards now. So now mixing becomes very in vogue and everybody's all on the balance train. And, you know, now it's not even good enough to be a child of the sim. You have to be that's level 1 bullshit, man. You know, I don't want to hear about your simplified flop strategies. Yo, I run aggregates, right? I got reports that say I'm aggro as fuck on these textures and I'm passive. So, you know, it starts to delve into the mixing realm, right? And people aren't good at it by nature. So randomization became a thing. And a lot of people spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to randomize pre-flop, how to randomize post, all this other shit, right? So that got refined. People got very good at it. Now you fast forward to like 2020, 2021, and what people are recognizing is that, oh, we're still playing against humans and they fucking suck because now we have mass data that just tells us that they fucking suck. So even with all these mixes, even with all these sims, even with all the randomization, we can still just find hotspots where it's like everybody's underperforming on these particular streets. Everybody's underperforming on these particular flop textures with their c-bet strategies. Nobody is complicating things enough. They're still choosing one-side strategies, yada, 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 yada. And what ultimately people are arriving at is, let's go pure again. Let's follow the incentive of the fucking hand. I don't care. Like, one of the things that I hear getting kicked around about like elite level heads up players, I think Doug said this in an interview, is they don't think about it as range versus range. They think about it as their hand, the incentives of said hand, and how that actually mirrors their opponent's range's defense strategy. And that makes sense because truly,
I feel like we've been, but like, ironically, like you've been saying that for a long time.
Yeah.
Like you've been saying like no, like just play your hand and like this hand is going to shift him that way,
Right.
and then you play that way. Yeah, it's kind of ironic, right?
well, I mean, it's logical. It wasn't an accident that I arrived at that conclusion. That's what card removal does, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you have a hand that eliminates certain candidates from your opponent's range, it means that he's imbalanced, period. That's the whole problem is like the concept of balance assumes that either both hands are unknown or that somehow multiple of the same card exist in the deck, right? Because the second that you have the ace of spades and he can't have the ace of spades, he becomes capped. And if he's capped, his availability to balance is just restricted, right? It's just limited. I think that like, you know, we've been saying this for 5 years now that we've been in a company. The evolution is you start to play and you think about your exact hand and where it ranks in the hand ranking order. Is it good? Is it bad?
Yeah.
You know, one pair beats two, or two pair beats one pair, trips beat two pair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you start thinking about like how your hand plays against the best possible hand your opponent could have. So you start to look at your hand and then you look at the board and you say, what's the nuts? And you say, oh, 9-10 is the nuts. I hope he doesn't have 9-10. But I have a pretty good hand because I have a set. And so like I play accordingly. Assuming he doesn't have 9-10, I get to make a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
Then the next evolution is, well, I have a range. So what does my range do against the best hand that he could potentially have? And so you start thinking in a range versus hand type comparison of like, okay, well, I have this cluster of hands that fit in this certain class that I want to bet. You know, I have hands that have like pair plus draw. I have hands that are sets. I have hands that are overpairs. All of these hands want to bet for different reasons: protection, for value, for bluff, yada, 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 right? So how does this cloud of hands perform against a hand my opponent could have? Well, if he's at the top of range, then I have X amount of equity. And that's really all I need to know, right? If he has the absolute best hand he has in his range, and I still have over the equity threshold necessary to continue, then I'm fine, right? I built my range out just fine, right? If he has the absolute top of range and I need 30% to continue, and I recognize that my hands are performing at 35%, I get to be aggressive, period. Simple. The last evolution previously was then range versus range. So how does my overall cloud of hands interact with my opponent's overall cloud of hands? But there's another step to that, right? And it's now analyzing or digging deeper into the micro of your range and saying, like, how does each one of my hands individually perform against my opponent's range? Because each one of my hands tells me something, right?
Yeah.
When I have this exact candidate with these exact suits, I know something more about his range. I'm able to narrow it a little bit more. And there are very specific incentives of this hand. So I do want to compare it to my global strategy, right? I want to look at this exact hand and say, like, okay, this hand wants to go aggressive. But now I do have to compare it to my global range, right? I have to say, like, does my range want to go aggressive? And if the answer is largely no, like, no, this is a super high frequency check. Okay, this is going to be a hand I utilize to protect my checking range, right? So we start to arrive at simple conclusions. This is a very long-winded explanation to basically say that, like, the last two masterminds have been an exercise in practical splits. So all we're looking at is when we arrive at mixed flop strategies where the solver kind of likes 2 or 3 sizes, and it also kind of likes a check, right? Like we use 9-6-3 rainbow in a single raise pot, for an example. It likes a big bet, like 15-20% of the time. It likes a small bet, like 50, 60, actually might have been like closer to like 70% of the time. And it likes a small amount of checking, right? Like maybe 15-20% of the time. That's like, well, when you look at the sim output, what you see is that all of the hands that big bet, also small bet.
Also small bet, yeah.
And sometimes check. Not all of them, but like some of them. Sometimes check, right?
Yeah.
And then all of the hands that small bet, also sometimes check. And it's just like, how the fuck can you ever parse through all of this in real time when you're only going to see 100 hands in this entire session and you're playing against Janitor Joe, who you certainly...
He's not a janitor, bro. He's a speculator.
He's a speculative Sam over there, you know, Prospector Pete, who's just trying to fucking flop gin. You're playing against Bingo Bob, and it's just like
Bingo Bob.
we don't need to be this goddamn precise to make money. As a matter of fact, we make more money by not being precise. We make more money by turning the error propensity on them trying to complicate or uncomplicate their counter strategy, right? So the simple thing you recognize is like, okay, if all the hands at small bet also check, do we need to check? What's the EV loss if we just don't check, right? And when you run it, it's like nothing. It's like, 0.05 big blinds of the pot. So like you're just losing nothing. It's like, okay, so now let's just have two bet sizes. And then you look at it and it's like, okay, well now if I reduce it just to 2 bet sizes, it's mixing. So every hand that bets big also bets small. That's problematic. So why don't we just look at the incentives of the 2 fucking ranges? And let's just say we're not going to bet big with top set because on 9-6-3, it just fucking blocks our opponent from having calls. And instead, let's bet big with middle set and bottom set, right? Okay, so now we have a really good hand in our smaller betting range. We have 2 really good subsets of hands in our big betting range. What else can we marry with this? Well, what other hands want to bet big? Hands that want to protect. So our 9X, particularly our strongest 9X, right? Ace 9, King 9, Queen 9. Okay, throw those in the big bet range, right? What else wants to protect? The overpairs that can get drawn out on easily. So 10s, jacks, queens. What hands don't care to big bet? Aces, kings. They don't need as much protection. We throw them in the small bet range, right? And you just practically split this way. And then we reran it and showed that we're losing like no fucking EV by taking this strategy. But you can intuitively look at this board and immediately know what your big bets are and what your small bets are. Well, that's the biggest takeaway is that, sure, if you're getting into mass data or mass volume where you're playing millions of hands a year, it's very, very critical that you're precise. You benefit a lot by being able to mimic a solve because the closer to that strategy you can apply over millions of hands, the more protected you are, and thus the more consistent win rate you have. However, if you're just one tabling, putting in very, very, very low volume, and you have an intimate knowledge of where your opponents are flawed, you're infinitely more incentivized to just maximize your exploits, right? And just play as practically as you possibly can to a point where it's unclear to them how you're deviating, but you're deviating, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like that's where I say, I use this phrase a lot, but it's losing the forest for the trees, right? So you're too focused on the trees to actually see the forest. And that's a lot of what's happening here. When you're so insanely focused on the minutia of the splits and making sure that all of your frequencies are correct and that all your mixes are correct and that you're randomizing and all this other stuff, you've forgotten about the fact that the true purpose of game theory in most instances is just to give you heuristics to think logically. So if we can literally just have a heuristic that says middle set is higher EV to bet big than top set because middle set gets called by more top pairs. That's pretty simple, right? That's a pretty simple rule of thumb to abide by. And it's way easier for people to understand that strategically than recognizing that like, oh, well, sixes goes hyper aggressive 72% of the time and 18% of the time they small bet and 10% of the time they actually check back for the sake of protecting range and like all of these things intertwine to earn you an extra 6 cents.
The 6 cents is true. It's true.